how do we get the right people in the room? We're talking about engaging diverse stakeholders, right? With a special focus on those who are most impacted, but historically least represented.
Welcome. You might be new to our series. You might be joining us for the first time, and you might be old friends that have been with us for the last few months. But we're hoping to sort of explore with you the top barriers that we've named in preventing equitable inclusion.
So what does it look like to go beyond the concept of having open invites to your community, but actually really finding ways to include and welcome diverse voices in your community? So what can you do to sort of proactively invite those voices?
And all of this is available to you through our inclusion guide. So go on the Ed Elements webpage and go ahead and download the guide, because we can't really cover all the things in our guide. Let's go ahead and get started talking about equitable inclusion.
So before we get into these different components, I just want to make sure that we clarify what we mean when we say the room. This sort of proverbial room is in reference to a lot of the conversations we have about what it means to bring diverse voices to the table. So we're pushing the conversation forward to say, let's not only look at the table and the identities of its guests, but let's also consider the room in which the table sits, the experiences people have before they enter the room, as they move through the room, or even after they depart the room. And so the conversation today is going to actually break up those different phases. So let's start by talking about how do we get the right people in the room, right? So if you're asking yourself, what does it mean by the quote unquote right people? We're talking about engaging diverse stakeholders, right? With a special focus on those who are most impacted, but historically least represented. So only your community knows what that is for you. And that can vary from district to district, from organization to organization. But taking special time to be intentional, right? In terms of who you're inviting into these decision-making moments and to your stakeholder engagement. And secondly, this question of what are the things that are preventing you from getting these folks into the room and making sure that your stakeholder engagement strategy is truly inclusive. So there are 4 barriers in particular that we've seen and we want to share today to kind of kick off this conversation. The first is what we often refer to as the fragility of an invitation. And so this is about the nature of any invitation to engage with this work. Sometimes we have these tacit expectations of diverse populations when it comes to equity work. We might expect them to teach us, to guide us, to respond to all requests for advice or insight. And we expect emotional vulnerability, unlimited availability. And if that expectation is not met, we may unknowingly place the onus on them or react punitively by not inviting them into the conversation again. So, as an example, let me put it this way. Let's say you're putting together focus groups and you make a personal invitation to someone whose background is not currently represented in the focus group. And they let you know that they're unavailable to attend. Will that be the last time that they get invited to share or to engage in this work? Will they be seen now as difficult or negligent or unwilling to help simply because they weren't available to be a part of it this one time? The second component revolves around intent. So here we're talking about your intentions when engaging stakeholders. Sometimes stakeholder engagement can be less about providing opportunities to co-lead, co-design, co-conspire even, and they function more as a touch point to hear, but not to listen, right? To appear, but not to really engage with people, or to even check off a box and say that we made those connections, we reached out to those communities, but those communities were never truly intended to be equal stakeholders and co-conspirators in this work. And so your intent may not always be explicit, it may not always be clear, but with matters that are as personal as that of racial equity, intent becomes critical to the success of the work. People need to see that you're engaging with them because you truly want to hear and learn from them and their experiences, and that your desire in the end is ultimately to redesign with them, not just for them. The third component revolves around the duration of your efforts. So there was a report in the American Psychological Association that found that short-term implicit bias trainings had little to no bearing on the long-term behavior. And if anything, they had more impact on the short-term knowledge of the vocabulary surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in other words, short-term efforts and solutions produced surface-level short-term results. And those who have been deeply impacted by racial inequity in your community, they're going to be invested in the nature of your efforts with respect to duration. So that's for both the engagement strategy and for the solutions that you're generating. Will there only be one opportunity to share, right? Before I was talking about one invitation, but perhaps there's multiple opportunities. Here we're talking about, is there just one opportunity? We're only going to hold one town hall for all Black and brown staff to share their experiences, or we're only going to hold one interview slot for whichever parent can make it. What this is going to communicate, or what this has the potential to communicate, is that one, there's an expectation of little to no substance to come from these engagement points, and or two, that there's no real intent to learn from the communities being invited to these endeavors. And so then when it comes time for solutions, are you planning to address it through one training or one short-term plan? So duration plays a role in the morale, but it's also relevant to both the stakeholder engagement and the solutions that you're generating. And then the fourth is about non-inclusive strategies. So inclusive decision-making is not just about including multiple voices. It's also about the strategies that you use for incorporating those diverse voices. Do you place an undue burden on those on the margins to generate all of your ideas and address all of your equity challenges? Or instead, do you limit their influence and their input to only address the areas that you're most comfortable with, or even limit them to areas that you deem to be most appropriate for them to speak to? That can show up in an interview by saying, well, this conversation is just focusing on this particular thing, and I don't want to derail us. But they might be bringing up something that hasn't been considered yet that ought to be considered. These things may shape how you craft a survey instrument, the language that you use when even extending an invitation, the way that you approach engaging stakeholders that accept that invitation, and ultimately what data and information you gather from the overall experience. So, at a high level, I just want to leave you all with a few tips. So one, be sure to avoid one-time invitations or short-term strategies. Instead, what I want you to focus on, multiple invitations and opportunities to engage. Avoid inviting diverse stakeholders to participate if you don't plan to truly engage them, to listen to them and incorporate their feedback. And instead, plan how you're going to document and codify the information shared, how you're going to incorporate it into your plans. Be intentional about those things beforehand. And then also allow the information to reveal new things to you and to evolve how you plan to incorporate it into your plans. And lastly, avoid non-inclusive strategies and expectations, those things that we were kind of sharing previously, and instead prioritize those that are most impacted and least represented in the work. Invite them in, but don't place sole responsibility on them.
So now that you've designed it and you're going to go check, I'm actively pausing, I'm mitigating against these barriers. You've been successful. You're bringing people into this more equitable, inclusive room to get to hear their voices and really design this experience. The question we're asking is, why have well-meaning people with the desire to really break the systemic inequities in education and really include the voices of disfranchised not been able to create the changes needed? And so these are the section that we call detours.